Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for coming out early. I'm hoping that you'll be a slightly more enthusiastic crowd than the undergraduates that I teach at a similar time in the morning. So maybe as many hangovers, but perhaps people with better coping strategies than the first years. So today, I want to talk to you about where the animals go. It's a collaborative project that I've just recently finished with designer Oliver Uberti. And it's a book that really talks about the animal tracking revolution, the ways in which big data and technology have transformed our understanding of the animal kingdom. Now, the book is packed full of many journeys, and I think the theme this morning of fantasy could tie very nicely into some of these journeys because they truly are fantastical. Take, for example, the Arctic terns that were tracked from the Netherlands. These are small birds, but they fly over the course of a year. Some of them flew the full length of the Atlantic down to the Southern Ocean. We knew they did that. But what we didn't know is that a large number of them that were tracked take a detour as far as New Zealand before then flying back along the Antarctic coast and back up to the Netherlands. A truly tremendous journey taking place over the course of a single year. And there are many others that we could talk about. There's a wolf that walked 1,000 kilometers from its place of birth in Slovenia to northern Italy to start another family and another community of wild wolves in Europe. Or we could go to northern Venezuela and talk about the oil birds that were most comprehensively described and observed as far back as Humboldt. And no one really thought to question their behavior. And the locals assumed that these birds spend their daytime in caves and then come out at night to feed off fruits before returning to the caves. But animal tracking and technology has shown that these birds actually spend 1 or 2 nights outside the cave before coming back again. And that makes a tremendous impact on the forest ecosystem because all the seeds and stuff that the birds are gathering, they're not just being dropped in the caves, they're actually being dispersed around the forest. And that's a really important kind of ecosystem service that these animals are providing. So there's a lot we can talk about, and there's a lot of surprises that the data is showing us about animal movements and animal behavior. But I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about another kind of animal, a mythical beast that is often found in the corners of maps in terra incognita. And that animal is the unicorn. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this, and I hadn't originally intended to do so, was that I've been to a number of talks over the last couple of weeks, particularly talking about careers advice being given to my students. And the phrase that is often used by people who work in data insight departments, people that do working with big data, is that we're searching for unicorns. We're searching for people that just don't exist. If you look at a current job spec or an advertised job, they sound pretty terrifying if you're trying to get into the data space, and particularly also the data visualization space and the design space. Often you need to learn 5 different programming languages, have an ability to tell stories with data, and have some kind of real-world insights into the data that you're processing and looking at. And it's a big ask. And I personally think that it devalues the craft of creating good data visualizations because actually an effective graphic requires many heads to come together in order to create something impressive. We can't just reduce it down to a single person's abilities. And I think that's an important theme that Oliver and I often discuss and come back to when we talk about what is it about the way that we work that comes together and does so well. So I want to make the case for ignoring unicorns and moving towards a more collaborative working process. And the way I want to make that case is through 3 different examples. We're going to go to the Southern Ocean and we're going to look at the seals that are tracking ocean temperatures. They're kind of sentinels for our oceans in the face of climate change. We're then going to move to California, and we're going to look at some mountain lions that are increasingly trapped and trying to work their way around the urbanization of LA and the major highways that crisscross California. And then finally, we're going to bring it closer to home, and we're going to look at some songbirds that live in a forest just outside of Oxford. So the starting point for many of these graphics that we produced is something that looks a bit like this. It's a big hairball of data that is generated from GPS tracks and other things. So in this case, this is data that was created by seals that have these sensors stuck to their heads. And the sensors show you where the animal goes, but also collect information about temperature and salinity and other things. And it turns out seals are really great ocean sensors because they get into the parts of the ocean that us humans really struggle with, along the coastlines, into really deep water and so on. And this was one of the first graphics I produced, and it was one that really excited me about the book project. It was one that showed so many things about the project that we were trying to achieve. The fact that there's more data than ever before, the data is really complex, and there's hundreds and hundreds of animals that have been tagged. So I would have left it there. But of course, I sent it over to Oliver, who puts it in a layout and starts designing it for the book. And the first thing he did, his immediate instinct was to get rid of all those individual colors for each seal, mute it all back, and just enable one track to come through, one particular story about one particular animal. And so this then got us thinking. I had to then go back into the data and find a particular track that would be representative of the whole. It would tell all the stories that we can see in that big hairball. And the seal we chose was Rudolph. Now these animals have brilliant names. The researchers vary from giving them a code. So our mountain lions have a particular code, whereas the seals go from everything from Santa's reindeer through to names of failing banks when they were tagged during the financial crisis. So looking at Rudolph, he was tagged for, I think, about 2 years in all. And he did this amazing journey. He swam south past the South Orkney Islands, along the Antarctic Peninsula, spent some time, a month or so, hauled out, fattening up, before then taking a swim across the Drake Passage towards the Falkland Islands. And looking at this track, zooming in this way, it starts to get you thinking and asking more and more questions about Rudolph's journey. What's the ocean floor like he's swimming over? How deep is the water? What are the temperature readings he's collecting? And we soon discovered that, in fact, this was the story and not the big hairball of data. So with kind of the confidence of Oliver's design and my keenness to kind of pack as much on as possible, we actually shrunk down the big hairball of data to a kind of a smaller part of this final graphic. And that gave us the space to put the bathymetry on, the ocean floor data, to annotate the track in more detail, and for people to get a full sense of Rudolph's spectacular journey in the Southern Ocean. And what's more, we gave him a second spread in the book, where we were able to show the temperature data and his dive depth. So these seals can dive to over 1,000 meters down, which is pretty spectacular. And while he's swimming along, he's gathering data points about the different, say, the temperature of the ocean. And we see him swim from relatively cold water to relatively warm water. And as a researcher, my instinct would always have been to put that big hairball as the front and center graphic, because that's kind of what looked cool. And then almost put these in as smaller supporting insets and things like that. But we need to move away from that, because I think there's a huge amount of excitement about big data graphics. And these things look incredibly complex, and they tell the story that the data are big and complex. But you step back from them for an extra 5 or 10 seconds and ask yourself, what is this showing me? And often it doesn't really give you much more than, oh, look at all the data that we've been able to collect. So this story really gave us the confidence to start a data reduction exercise in many ways. We went from, in almost all the graphics, we went from a massive database of points, and we spent time selectively pulling out the best stories that picked out the whole. And you see this all the time. I mean, if you look at the Planet Earth series that the BBC does, they don't tell you the story of an entire colony of birds. They'll tell you the story of one mating pair or something like that, which can then scale to the whole colony. So I mentioned before that one of the reasons we wanted just to focus on one track was this idea of context, getting a sense of the environment that the seals passing through. And this is really came to the fore when we were looking at our mountain lions in California, because these are animals that are competing with humans all the time for space, for resource. And so when we show their journeys, so this is just the raw data, this is the sort of thing you may see in a scientific paper about the animals. Again, the researchers are keen to show all the data they've collected, and I've chained together a couple of the points here that the animals have collected just so you can see the journeys, but you can see how these points are not random. There are certain hard edges to them where you can see the animals being squeezed against something, or there's gaps where there's definitely the animals can't go to. So this was a story where we were really keen to get the context right, but it still ensuring that the data kind of shines through. And so we live in a world where there's tremendous volumes of contextual information we can now download and use for free. So this hasn't been styled. This is just kind of how it would look when I load it into my software. But you can see here that these are rivers and lakes alone, and you can see the detail that exists for California. And so how do we squeeze that in to the maps? Because this is important, and we haven't even thought about the urban areas and the roads and so on and so forth. What's more, we wanted to show the terrain. And so the terrain data comes in the form of essentially an image you can download. It's collected by a special kind of satellite where high or bright values are high areas and then dark values are low areas. And what I'm able to do is take this flat image and run it through a thing called a hill shading algorithm, which is something that's commonly used now in everything from sort of 3D game design through to cartography, through to other kinds of things where you're trying to essentially shine a fake light onto a surface and see where the shadows would fall. And that's what we have here on the bottom image. And all too often, it's kind of left there in a lot of maps. People may overlay an image on top of it to give some color, but the shadows can be quite dark and quite harsh. So we were keen to kind of keep the definition, but push it to the background some more, because we wanted to put so many other layers on top of it. So I spent a few months perfecting a stippling algorithm. I wrote some computer code that converted the hard pixels into small dots, and those dots started to soften the image. It meant that we could push things to the background some more, and then we were able to combine it with other contextual information too. So this is slightly trickier to see here, but you can just about make out how we've got some slightly lighter areas. We've put a color through this, and then where the slightly yellower areas are, that's actually urban sprawl, that's urbanization. And so people can begin to differentiate between the urban and the rural areas as we look at this map. You can get a sense of where the mountains are, but they're not screaming at you. There's not these dark, dark shadows. And then that's our basis for layering things up. So we spent a lot of time looking at the legibility of labels and things like that, how they appear on the map, and the ways in which we can put the roads and the rivers and things like that on. So this is the second to last version of the graphic. where you can see we've simplified the data quite a lot. So we've only focused on 5 lions. We've taken their tracks, and then those that have a kind of territorial pattern where there's just lots of points on top of each other, we've simplified that to a home range where there's just a single simple shape. And then all those other data points that I was so keen to show as kind of demonstrations and examples of the volumes of data that we've been able to collect are shown in this brownie color around the main lions that we've focused on. But we still weren't quite satisfied with this. And again, this comes back to that iterative process of me looking at something and then Oliver looking at it and then vice versa. And we weren't satisfied because there was some additional information we wanted to show here. And those brownie data points weren't really adding much to the graphic. In fact, they look more like mountains than data points. And so we took the decision to take those off altogether. They weren't telling us anything more about the stories that we were showing for the animals, that they're struggling to make a living in this kind of urbanized environment. And then that freed us up to add some more context. So national parks, for example, have been able to be squeezed on there and so on. So there's many, many layers here. I mean, the data are, in fact, the smallest part of this graphic. If you think about the volumes of information we're trying to convey, it's, of course, the most important element. But it's the way that we're able to work together to pull out all the other kind of contextual information and show it in this detailed format. And this, too, is actually one of the nice things about a book, because you're not trying to get these things to work on a tiny iPhone screen as well as a big 27-inch iMac and all the rest of it. The parameters are fixed. We know what the printing resolution is, and so we can really work hard to do get the kind of right definition and so on in our work. Now, the final example I wanted to show is how we were able to tell the story of some songbirds in Whitton Woods, just outside of Oxford. Now, this is one of the images that was in the academic research paper about this data set, and it shows an experimental design where they've put 4 bird feeders, just like you'd find in anyone's garden, 4 bird feeders in a grid pattern, and each bird feeder had a receiver on it. And what they do in Whitton Woods is they tag all the birds with chips. And so they ring the birds, but also put these little chips on them, which means that every time they visit a feeder, the feeder knows the bird's been there. And so it's collecting information about every time a bird visits a feeder, you know who the bird is and what its species is and so on. And this information then gets pulled together for them to work out what the social networks of the birds are. Are there particular species that enjoy spending more time together? How do they cooperate or fight for food sources and things like that? And so the raw data was visualized just as a series of line graphs in this way. Each of the 4 feeders is a cluster of lines from the top to the bottom, and then each line is colored by the bird species. And then from left to right, we have time. So in fact, there are 3 days worth of data here. And where the lines get really wiggly, that shows us that there's lots of activity around that feeder. That's where the birds are. And the researchers discovered that birds like busy feeders. They like to go where all the action is, where all the other birds is. So you could have 3 completely empty feeders with no competition, exactly the same food. But if one of the feeders has got a lot of activity around it, then the other birds will gravitate towards it. And they think this is because, 1, you get some sense of strength in numbers, but 2, it's a bit like us walking past a busy restaurant and we'd rather queue up for the busy restaurant rather than risk it with the empty restaurant next door. There must be something good in this place and we want to be part of it. So that's the story, and it's repeated every day, so we just focused on one particular day. But looking at these line graphs, we were really struggling with how to make them slightly more engaging and get people's eye into the story so they have a sense of what's going on. And I think this is where working with a designer to get a sense of metaphor or some kind of story that enables you to immediately relate to the data that's being shown. So I went back to the raw data and produced this plot, which looks like a bit of a mess, but really it was a kind of a breakthrough moment for us on this graphic. I gave each bird a point, so that every time a bird appeared at a feeder, it plotted a data point. And we have 4 feeders, the horizontal lines running from top to bottom. Time is along from left to right. And then I put some random scatter up and down so that all these points should really be plotted perfectly along each line, but I've actually added some scatter. And this was the reason I was doing that was I was trying to get this sense of activity and freneticism around each of the feeders at any particular time. And we were also able to track the movements of individual birds from one feeder to the other to see if there was a particular routine or something like that. So this didn't look particularly spectacular, but it was the starting point. It got us thinking that, oh, maybe we can actually, think about turning these data points into bird seed or something like that, because, there's a scattering of them around. And so taking this point from this moment here, we were then able to produce this final graphic where you can see that Oliver's converted our clusters of points. We've flipped them round. We've added a couple of adornments to make them look a bit like bird feeders. We've tightened the distributions together, and we've been able to colour the dots by the species of bird. And we've simplified it right down to show only a few journeys of individual birds. But immediately you get this sense of a busyness at some times of day, and then silence at others around particular feeders. Particularly feeder 4 here, you can see that the birds are really only going to it at particular concentrated times of day. So it's not a mapped example, of course, but it's a good one that that really came out of a huge amount of discussion and trying to think about how we can take millions and millions of data points. This is an absolutely enormous data set because it was collected over a long period of time, and just boil it down to the bare essentials of the story that we're trying to tell. So my final slide is by way of conclusion, and it's suggesting that we need to be a bit more baboon and a bit less unicorn. This is probably the most random final slide I've ever done. And the reason I was thinking about baboons in this context was because one of the stories in the book is about how baboons make decisions. And although they have an alpha male and an alpha female, those 2 baboons don't have any particular say over where the troop goes on a given day. It's all consensus-based. They're actually very democratic. And they've got these high-resolution GPS tags on them that capture the moment a decision's made. And what tends to happen is they may run off in different directions, but then come together in sort of at a balanced view. And I think this consensus basis to kind of decision-making is really the secret to Oliver and I's success. I mean, we're still working together after doing over 200 maps, I think, is probably what we've done across both books. And every time we're taken as equals in the process. What so often happens, particularly as an academic, I mean, I'm the only academic I know who's working on an equal basis with a designer. What tends to happen is, I'll do something that looks a bit rubbish, and then that gets sent over to a designer who has to then somehow make it fit into whatever the publication is. Whereas from day one, from the first moment we're discussing things collaboratively, we're trying to put out the stories, that then informs my data processing and analysis and everything that I do with the kind of end design in mind. And then that then frees Oliver up to then add the kind of extra adornments and all the really important stuff that helps people understand the data and tells the stories that we're trying to show. So on that note, I'd like to leave it there and say thanks very much for your attention. So the question was, do I have any plans to go digital? Everything we do is print-based. I personally don't have any particular plans. I mean, I do work on projects where we do online mapping and web mapping and things like that. And I think this comes back to this idea of, what I was saying at the beginning about these unicorns who can do everything. I think print is a completely different art form from digital. And one of the things we're, I think, keen to resist is taking these books and making them digital. I think we'd love to do it. On one level, we'd love to do it, but it would mean employing like developers for a year or something to get the data in such a way that works online. Because one of the things that we have is obviously people now have a certain set of expectations about how digital works. They want interactivity, they almost want real-time stuff, they want to be able to pan and zoom, clicking on things and bringing data up and all that kind of thing. And there's such complexity behind these that it would take additional efforts on our part to do the processing and get everything formatted properly, and then it would take someone else who's really good at digital mapping and design to then bring it alive. So often, people say, well, why don't you just do a digital map of this? And you say, well, it will take, it was like doing 2 book projects for the sake of one. And also, we really enjoy print. Print's not dead by any means. And you go into a bookshop and there's, books are getting nicer and nicer and nicer because people want to buy something tangible. And, just picking the thing up, it's a much bigger screen than people are used to seeing nowadays. The resolution is really high. And it's, one of the most gratifying things about doing books is the number of people that come up to me and say, oh, I left it on my coffee table and there was a crowd of people looking around it because they, flicking through it. Or I had there was a visit day on Wednesday for students coming to UCL, and one of them said, oh, I got your book for Christmas last year and it's still by the side of my bed. And you just wouldn't get that with digital. And so, we're keen to keep pushing print. Do you want to go in the orange?
I'm interested in your work relationship with a designer because I've had some experience, and you have science, which is data information, whereas design is like reduction. So I wondered how that worked for you in terms of was it difficult to get used to that reduction, or I'd like to hear it.
So the question was, science is all about data and information, and design is about reduction. So how do we come across? How do we come to some agreement on that? I think I would probably disagree with your premise about science not being about reduction. Actually, I think particularly all the hype and excitement about big data. A huge amount of work is essentially going into data reduction. So my day job in a way is coming up with approaches to taking thousands of variables about people. In fact, I don't work on animal data particularly, and coming up with some kind of summary measures from that. So data reduction, I think, is important. I think where there is, I think I'm better at it now, but scientists generally think that their work is the most important thing in the world, and everyone should care about it. And they have to think that way because they'd go mad otherwise. You need that kind of self-belief, and we can handle peer review where people just say they're very direct and not very nice to you about your kind of academic credentials in a way. But I think scientists often struggle when it comes to being told that the wider world doesn't care about what you're doing unless you tell them why it's important and you tell them in a way that is understandable. And I think that's kind of a skill I've learned a lot from Oliver. And then the second thing is one of the most refreshing things that we try and do, I think, and our publisher gives us the space and the freedom to do, is to keep things complicated if they are complicated. There's no pressure to make things simple. So if the graphic needs, and this comes back to the point about having print where people can spend a bit of time looking at it, if there's complexity in the graphic or there's complexity in the data, we can try and preserve that in what we're doing. And it's not about simplification for the sake of simplification. It's about empowering people to get their heads around the complexity. And I think that's one of the things I get slightly frustrated about when you see lots of infographics and design and you hear people talk about data visualization and way. That there's this kind of a group out there that do things they have this view that people can't handle complexity, and that's not true. They can. You just need to give them the tools to understand it. And I think that's where the design is a really important element of what we do.
I really echo the scientists. I'm a designer, but I work with data scientists at the government actually. And we're doing a lot of stuff with big data at the moment. We're just about to start looking at mapping. One of you touched on some techniques really to not simplify but enable the story to come out by kind of flattening some of the detail, so kind of softening colours. I'm guessing that the book you produced is more about stories. I'm kind of interested to know if you plan or have any material on the steps you've learned, the techniques that you and your partner have developed to help. Because you've got some repeatable techniques in there that we could actually make use of and sort of apply the principles of to enable our data to speak in the same way. I'm curious about whether you have any material that we kind of just look at, kind of tutorial stuff, that sort of thing.
Okay, so the question was whether I have any materials or resources that help talk through some of the processes that we've gone through and enable others to learn. So I put stuff. I've got a few online tutorials and things about how I do the R programming. So I use this stats package called R, which some people may have come across for a lot of the data processing work. The tricky thing about the design element and the working together is that it's actually quite hard to formalize that in a particular way. I mean, a lot of it is just many hours shunting things around or adjusting colors or me tweaking parameters in some computer code and something like that. And that's quite hard to formalize. You know, the rules exist, and I think there's a lot of resources out there already on good principles of design. So someone like Alberto Cairo or Andy Kirk and people like that have got some good books on the kind of mechanics of it. But the secret sauce is actually quite hard to formalize, and it only really comes up when you try and do something yourself. I mean, that's something I had some satisfaction the other week teaching some second year students. I did a visualization workshop, and it was just nice to see some of the pain, other people going through the pain that we often go through when we do this stuff. So they have all these big ideas about taking a data set and visualizing it. And that's really exciting that they're able to do that. And then they sit down and they look at the data and think, oh no, that's missing something, or we can't quite do that with it because it's, and it's the kind of the grunt work of taking the raw data and visualizing it is you can't really teach that. You just have to have people that are motivated enough to get through it. Yep. So the question was, does the book or do the books aid in data visualization, understanding, and perception, things like that? I think they do. So if you look at the books, they look very different, and there's two. There were they had separate. We had separate ambitions when we started them. So the London book every map is different. So there's 100 maps and graphics, and no two are the same technique. And I think where that has been really useful to people is this giving them set graphic forms, giving them ideas, inspiration to take some data and show it in a different way. And we're not doing it for the sake of it. You know, we thought long and hard about the representations we used. So I think there's inspiration in there for people that are looking for moving away from kind of a standard set of visual forms. The animals book is much more subtle in a way, and I think it's the first time I've seen anyone try and combine the kind of narratives of big data and technology and all that kind of stuff with essentially classical cartographic design. So if you look at it, you'll see that, what you've seen already is that the maps are quite traditional. In a sense, they're quite traditional in the way that they're portrayed. But we have this complex data that we're putting on top of them. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the book for me is this idea that we've got decades or centuries of cartographic design, best practice and all that stuff that has essentially been binned by a lot of the big data visualization work because it's being done by people who haven't, they shouldn't. Why should they know about it? Because they're often computer scientists and from people from a completely different background. So I think giving people the confidence to then marry the two back together, I think is an important thing. The graphics themselves, I think all of them can be made digitally. They can all be scaled and put online, but it's just a question of, it's a resourcing issue. If you gave me enough money to pay a developer, then we could try and do it, but it's getting the resource to do it that's important, I think.